This is Art Sense, a podcast focused on educating and informing listeners about the past, present, and future of art. I'm Craig Gould. On today's episode, I speak with Tina Kukielski, the Susan Sollins Executive Director and Chief Curator for Art21. Art21 is a leader in art-focused content that includes television series, films, publications, digital programs, and a wide variety of educational resources. Most famously, Art21 is responsible for the production of the Peabody Award-winning PBS-broadcast television series, Art in the 21st Century. The conversation includes the history of the organization, the goals of their programming, the challenges they face, and the upcoming 11th season of Art in the 21st Century, which debuts April 7th at 10 p.m. Eastern on all PBS outlets. And now, a conversation about art in the 21st century with Art21's Tina Kukielski. Tina Kukielski, thank you for joining me today on the Art Sense podcast. Tina, you are the Susan Sollins Executive Director and Chief Curator of Art21. I am excited to talk to you today about the 11th season of Art in the 21st Century that's going to be premiering on PBS on April 7th. You know, Tina, in your role, I imagine a lot of people that know the art world have passionately been watching Art in the 21st Century for decades. But on those occasions where you run into someone who doesn't know about the program, who doesn't know who Art21 is, where do you start to try to explain to them what your mission is?
Yeah, well, thank you, Craig. I'm so glad to be here today. Art21 has the opportunity to bridge those viewers that are in the art world and outside the art world. And I think in particular, the audience beyond the sort of confines of the sort of bubble of the art world has been a target audience for Art21 over the course of our history. You know, as an organization, we were really built on the belief of expanding access to contemporary art. And we incorporated in the late 90s. Our founder, Susan Sollins, really envisioned the way to do that, and she was a museum educator. For her, the way to do that at that time in the late 90s was through public media. And she had the opportunity through a set of relationships she had to learn television and filmmaking, and ultimately pitched this idea of let's expand access to the ideas embedded in contemporary art, the ideas that contemporary artists hold, through public media by making a television show. And she pitched that to PBS, and she pitched it at the same time to the National Endowments for the Arts. And both partners came on board to really initiate a television series devoted to that. And at the time, I think it's easy to take that for granted now. So we're a 26-year-old organization now in 2023, but thinking back to where contemporary art was at the end of that millennium, it really just wasn't the sort of the populist thing it is today. Contemporary people didn't necessarily know contemporary artists or couldn't necessarily even name contemporary artists. Now, of course, with major corporate brands, we're seeing the sort of influence of living artists on fashion and the like in a more mainstream way. But in the late 90s, it was pretty radical. And what artists were doing on camera was weird and different. Fortunately, because of PBS as our very earliest distributor, and they still distribute our television series, Art in the 21st Century, we were ultimately and very quickly able to connect with that audience beyond the art world. So to get back to your question, through, the member stations that represent PBS across, in that time, it was really specifically targeted across the United States, for instance. So for those that don't know us, we do operate a bit on a knife's edge in terms of those that do know the work of Art21 through film. They love us. And we have a sort of core audience that has been built over the course of the last 26 years. For us as an organization, we're always trying to push to expand new audiences. And when I talk about the knife's edge, I guess what I mean by that is sometimes Art21 is referred to as the best kept secret in the contemporary art world. And that's something that, we wrestle with.
I tried to remember back to the first time I saw Art in the 21st Century in its first season, and it just seemed to open my mind to a whole world of possibilities. Because, back in that day, what would be close to 24 years ago, I guess at this point, we didn't have YouTube. We didn't have all of this media being produced by artists, by galleries, by museums. And you go through art education, you have the opportunity for a handful of artist visits, but you're not able to go into the studio with a blue chip artist and actually kind of open up their head and see their studio practice. And it just seemed to bring the art world alive and kind of make it accessible. My question to you is, I think it's just as intriguing now as it was 24 years ago, but how are you able to adapt to a world where we're now swimming in all of this other media? Does the mission change? How do you find your place within an ecosystem that has changed?
I think ultimately the changes that have happened in terms of, the production of digital content focused on art, on contemporary art, whether that's through, the lens of media, a media organization, media entity, or our peers at, museums and galleries, ultimately has been a good thing for us as an organization. As the field has expanded, first and foremost, it's pushed us on the film side in particular, but I think also on the curatorial side, to do more, to be different, to really support this idea of film excellence when it comes to the quality and standard that we hold in terms of the films that we send out into the world. They are not quick edits. They are thoughtful. They are beautiful. They use, in many cases, some more advanced filmmaking techniques that we think that have evolved over the course of our 26-year history. Our earliest seasons, when I look back on them now, there's a sort of core, let's say, approach to working with contemporary artists that is still very much a part of the DNA of Art21. But filmically, in terms of the style, our most recent film, and you're going to see this in our upcoming Art in the 21st Century season, it embraces a style and beauty that is very contemporary. We used to never use music. In fact, our earliest films were rather they were quiet, they were direct, they were simple, and at times there was a lot of silence. And of course, we embrace the silence when it's necessary and right in the context of the an unfolding of a process or an idea. So all this to say that the sort of the competition and the expanding landscape of video content has just pushed us to do more on the film side and to do it better and of a higher quality. And one of the ways that I think we do that particularly well is that our film productions have really become a site of collaboration for us as an organization, and we have now a growing community of filmmakers and producers and editors and directors and cinematographers who help to support and advance our work in that space. And that's been really exciting to learn, collaborate with that group. And that's now even, started maybe initially as a group local to New York City, but that's really advanced as we've pushed our productions out to other parts of the country and in turn other parts of the world. So we have opportunities to hire, filmmakers in Nairobi, Kenya, or in, Hong Kong, or in Johannesburg, South Africa, that have become contributors to the work of Art21. That being said, I think at the same time, to get to your question, we do have a style and approach that is rather unique and maybe doesn't and it has been consistent. And that's what I was getting at. The sort of like the DNA of an Art21 film has been true to its sort of original creation in the late 90s. And as documentaries have proliferated, there's become sort of tropes of documentary that are very easily recognized and, popularized. Not to say that we push against that, but the Art21 style is artists speaking directly to the camera. The interviewer gets removed. Very, very rarely do you see critics, collectors, or explaining what it is that you see. We have every opportunity possible to allow the artists to speak for themselves, to explain the artwork directly to the viewers. And we're very conscious and deliberate in that. And I think ultimately it is unique to Art21's way of working. We've seen many people replicate it, and we enjoy the sort of copycats. It's been fun, and always, I think, strokes our ego and when people make derivative Art21 productions or productions in the style of Art21. But it's given us an opportunity to almost reinforce what it is that we do.
It does still feel like all of these films have that Art21 DNA. It feels like a lot of times that would, in the end, be maybe the work of the editor. How do you collaborate with filmmakers? Is editing centralized, or is the whole production kind of given to a team and they bring you back a finished product? I imagine there is a great deal of collaboration, correct?
Oh, yes. And while we hire, teams outside that might contribute to portions of the film, whether that's a director or a producer or an editor, everything sort of goes through the Art21 production and curatorial team. So any film that we make, essentially has an overseeing series producer, whether that's a short film that we make, just for digital release, or if it's our television show. And those series producers uphold the Art21 standard of working, and are oftentimes very involved as a sort of silent producer in moving a project along. It's totally right to recognize that everything comes together in the context of the edit. Sometimes it's almost like it's magic. When you think about, in many cases, we might film 40 hours of footage that we then whittle down to a 55-minute show. So you can do the math on that. But the role of the transcripts is rather key, and I imagine it's probably similar in your work as making podcasts. Obviously you have your film footage, so you have the opportunities that you identified at the outset and evolve over time, where artists are present, where their artworks are present. Key to our process is getting process imagery. So opportunities where you see something in the making, where it changes over time. That is always our objective, is capturing as much of that as possible, which is why our production periods tend to run rather long, sometimes up to 12 months, so that we can really see the development of an idea and an artwork, or an installation, or an exhibition kind of evolve over a longer period of time. But it does require quite a bit of creative energies on the part of like the internal Art21 team to ensure that we are, when we do release a new episode or a new film, that it lives up to a kind of Art21 standard. And now I'd say there's even more and more of the responsibility to do that, because we have now 550 films in our film catalog, and we've worked with over 250 artists over the course of these last 25 plus years. So we recognize more and more that it's not just that we've released a new film, but in fact, what we've actually done is we've built a really massive collection of artist voices vis-a-vis these finished films. So creating some continuity between the archive, the back catalog, and what we do today and tomorrow is really critical.
I think you want the film to hit you in the sense that it's all just, a download of someone's mind and their perspectives, and you're understanding better. That's easier said than done. But, I think the other thing that strikes me is Art21 is also, like you said, providing an archive of artist voices and a history of these voices as they lived in their time, right?
Yeah. I mean, I do believe it's sometimes as what you leave out of a film is sometimes as important as what you put in. And that can be sometimes really challenging because we all, when it comes to artwork, we all sort of have our favorites or things that resonate in the context of of a public audience, or, might sort of look great in the context of the camera or the footage. But ultimately, what we really want to support is the furthering of the understanding of the ideas embedded in contemporary art. So sometimes that means, making choices that sometimes can be hard choices in the interest of, really demystifying the process as much as possible.
Different seasons take on different themes. I believe season 10 was kind of a continued examination of place. What are the themes that are being explored in season 11? Are these artists grouped together in a particular way?
Yeah, they are. And in fact, this season, season 11, it harkens back to some of the earliest seasons of art in the 21st century. Season 1 and season 2, which aired in 2001 and 2003, respectively. Well, first and foremost, they focused exclusively on artists working in the United States. We've done that here for season 11, and in part, that was a decision that was responsive to the, restrictions, the travel restrictions set in the context of the pandemic when we were curating this season back in 2020 and 2021. We were, completely uncertain about the potential for us to be able to go to far parts of the world. So that necessitated a rethink when it came to how we had been doing the seasons previously, meaning season 8, 9, and 10, the last 3 seasons we've done. We've gone to, locations, mostly cities, although we did in season 10 go to the US-Mexico border as a, geographic site that has inspired artists to look at place as a lens through which artists might shape, a body of work. And in fact, I think in some ways, looking back on that period of our, the last 3 seasons in which that was the mold and the structure, I think it was rather responsive to maybe more mainstream trends in television and film, when it came to opportunities through art to tour the world, this idea of art tourism, which is not unlike food tourism or any other ways that you might tell a story. And that was fun while it lasted. And I think we'll continue to do that in the context of individual artists' practices as those opportunities have arise in the future. But there seemed to be a missed opportunity when it came to allowing artists and allowing a kind of connective tissue to unfold over the course of our individual episodes. So this season, we really didn't want artists, while they might not necessarily be artists that you see grouped together in in a multi-artist show that you'd see at the Guggenheim or at MoMA or even at the Whitney, but we did want artist practices that were rather diverse and maybe, like, on the surface unrelated, to speak to each other in the context of the program we were putting together. So as much as we were identifying artists and opportunities and bodies of work that felt like they had a new level of prominence coming, in the context of the pandemic, coming out of the pandemic, we also wanted to we wanted the series ultimately to address broader questions that we saw were evident in artistic practices, especially as artistic practices pivoted in the context of a pandemic. And there were a couple key questions that were rising to the fore once we had decided ultimately that we would look through the lens of the United States, thinking about this series more broadly as questioning what art in America now looks like in 2023. First and foremost, one of those themes, if you will, I'll use your word, with thinking about this question of representation and who and what gets to represent a culture. Initially, our thought was to do a show about monuments. Of course, there's been a widespread movement to revisit, to re-envision, to dismantle, and in some cases rebuild monuments in the United States. Now, I think that's a conversation that's like proliferating globally. However, we really weren't interested in doing a rather staged show that just looked at one monument or one artist that was addressing that idea, one to the next, and instead thought, and what we saw artists doing was really responding to this question of representation in the context of their own lives, in the context of the sort of humbleness of the studio. And there was this quite everydayness in the way that artists were approaching this question of representation. So our first episode for this season is called Everyday Icons, and is really about artists who are re-envisioning an iconography. You could even say an American iconography through their work. So you see artists like Amy Sherald, who are giving the representation of Black lives immense visibility through her rather beautiful, colorful portraits of Black life in the United States. You see someone like Daniel Lynn Ramos, who's working in Puerto Rico, where he has lived his entire life, who is collecting the sort of refuse, both the natural refuse and the refuse that has been impacted by significant environmental destruction that has happened on the island, to create these almost totem-like, these shrine-like objects that themselves become, activated both politically, spiritually, in the context of his neighbors and community in Puerto Rico. Or you see someone like Rose B. Simpson, who is an artist who works in the Santa Clara Pueblo in New Mexico, where she was born, who has learned sort of matrilineal practice of play, and who makes these, some cases, towering forms that hover between spaces, between worlds, between beings, and between identities. Or you see someone like Alex DeCorte, whose work is riffing so much on the icons of popular culture, both those of the past and those of the, like someone like Duchamp, in some cases, those of the past, the present, and the future, but really creating his own very intimate relationship with those icons that we all share, and of course have now been exported across the world. So that's the first episode. Maybe I can get to the second and third.
I think one of the things that is obvious there is not only are the topics timely and relevant, but I feel like one of the things that's always been consistent about art in the 21st century is its ability to cut across different strata of the art world. There winds up being these huge names alongside mid-career artists, alongside unheralded artists that, many of us have never heard of. A lot of times those unheralded names, those strangers to us, always wind up being most inspiring. I mean, can you talk about what goes into curating the artists that will be profiled? I mean, how do you find them, and how do you choose?
Yeah, it's quite a process. In fact, our curatorial approach for season 11, it was probably the most extended curatorial process I've ever been a part of. Well, first and foremost, it's not just me that makes any curatorial decision. So I am a member of our curatorial team. But our assistant curator, Jarrell Lewis, our producers, Nick Ravitch, Ian Forster, and Andrea Chung, all participate in the conversations around curatorial choice and where we commit ourselves in terms of our upcoming productions. And I'd say there's a couple different ways in. I mean, the curatorial process is really multifarious in a way. We're obviously looking at artists. We're seeing what artists are doing in the context of museums and galleries, and we're reading the art press. We're paying attention to upcoming projects, solo shows, commissions, the like. We're traveling. We're looking at international biennial lists, in particular biennials that are happening a little further from home. We're doing studio visits, introducing ourselves to artists. That's been really important. Most artists in the US and I'd say increasingly like in the UK and in other English speaking parts of the world know us. But we have a little work to do for folks internationally to understand the kind of Art21 way of working. So that's always a really important part of the process. And I think second to that, we're trying as much as possible to connect art to everyday life. I mean, one of the artists this season, Rose B. Simpson, says it. There's no separation between art and life. And as much as possible, when we can show that through our films and make that connection, and I haven't even really talked so much about our education program, but make that connection in the context of the way that our films play out in the classroom, I think all the more, powerful the message can be. So that's been a big subject in our curatorial conversations is, what is happening in the world today? What are the sort of like major social, political, environmental issues that we think artists are responding to and addressing or have something to say about? Whether that's, widespread migration and displacement, environmental disaster, political divides that are manifesting across various parts of the world. Those big questions come into the curatorial conversation. So we try, this is where we are sort of a media organization in other respects, where we're actually also trying to track what are the dominant conversations today, because we believe that artists have a really important role to play in terms of how we're going to solve them and how we'll be able to design a better future that can be a safer, more creative and inclusive and comfortable space for everyone.
Well, you referenced there that the resources expand beyond just the number of episodes to a wider array of resources for education. What does that look like? What all is available? What all is enabled by the foundation? And what do those resources look like?
I'd say recognizing the opportunities for Art21 to have impact in the classroom has been a big part of the story of our evolution as an arts organization. Again, like I mentioned earlier, we were founded 26 years ago and really incorporated in order to make a television show. But I think the first really big pivot before, to your point about content going on YouTube and what has happened in the course of the digital transformation of the last, let's say, 15 years. I mean, before that took place in the first decade of our existence, really in the 2000s, Art21 built an education program that really actively put the resources beyond our films. So we produce education guides. We have those education guides include prompts and questions to get groups of people talking about what it is that they're seeing. And those education guides, as well as a set of workshops that Art21 has designed over the course of the last 15 to 20 years, have been a really active part of what we do. So our education team has really identified teachers as a core constituent when it comes to Art21's relationship with the education world beyond film. So we do a series of professional development programs. Since the pandemic, all of those programs have been, well, first and foremost, they went on Zoom, they became digital programs. And now that things are opening up again, we're going to continue with a hybrid program as much as possible to get in the room with teachers, teachers are really important gatekeepers for us when it comes to delivering not only the ideas embedded in contemporary art, but the Art21 approach to pedagogy in the context of our arts education program is really targeted at getting people to think critically and creatively in the context of the classroom, whether that can really exist across subject matters. It connects to ethics and history and language and arts beyond the visual as well. And that's a really important core principle. So our films, they live in the context of a distributed media landscape. But I think where you see the most impact in terms of our work is really what happens in the context of how our films and resources play out between teacher and student in the context of the classroom.
These films don't have to be limited to just the art instructor in the art classroom. They're really well suited for a number of subjects. Art is able to open up a world to people where they didn't even anticipate they were going to sit down and be thinking about quote unquote art, right?
Absolutely. I mean, I think it ultimately gets people excited because art exists in a space of expanded possibility. And I think that's that can be the real beauty of art, is that it can be probabilistic and futuristic and abstract and impossible and imaginary and all these things that I think ultimately become inspirational and aspirational, and can, I think, really get a group of people activated, in particular around a conversation that might be more likely to divide a group of people into, and instead, I think, find a place for people to come together.
Our current political landscape, have any of the resources ever had pushback as being viewed as having some sort of agenda? Or, I mean, because that's one of the things that's kind of a battleground in certain parts of the country, is what voices students have access to.
I mean, that's a big concern for us now in terms of seeing what's happening in the education landscape of a place like Florida, for instance, and the attack on critical race theory that's playing out across the United States. This is where our relationship with PBS as a distributor does actually feel really essential. And, our sense in terms of what's happening today, in the classroom across America, is that, some public media organizations are still recognized as, not as liberal media, but instead as media, I suppose. So we're trying as much as possible to produce content that isn't, I guess, self-censoring in a way. At the same time, we are, because we're following and tracking what artists are saying and what they're doing. Sometimes those ideas push against norms and can sometimes be considered radical. But we're all the time in touch with our teachers now, and our teachers when I say our teachers, we support, our teacher training program. We have a program called Art21 Educators. It's now over 100 teachers across America, I think from 46 states. So just a couple states don't necessarily have representation. For sure, we hear a lot about the rural-urban divide. That seems to be a really big issue. And under us, as much as possible, trying to understand that in the context of our curatorial and work, our production work is vital and important. But we try as much as possible to listen to teachers, like, what are the issues that you're seeing play out? And certainly we recognize that there are some teachers who have no problem delivering the ideas embedded in any one of our films to their students. And there's a lot of teachers that, would get fired if they were to, teach with certain artists in the Art21 family. So I suppose it's a bit of a reality, but we try as much as possible to to deliver more content, to provide as many opportunities for a way into the subject matter as possible.
Well, we touched earlier about how the films kind of cut across the strata of the art world, and I know that we're going to be introduced to somebody that we're just going to fall in love with. Is there anybody in particular from this roster of artists from this season that maybe you weren't really aware of their work 2 or 3 years ago, but now you're just like, I can't wait to let the world know about this particular artist?
Absolutely. I mean, I think in our first episode, Everyday Icons, we're getting a lot of great feedback from the artist's portrait of Rose B. Simpson, who is still probably one of the youngest artists in this upcoming season, and certainly is not yet a household name. However, Rose's very personal relationship, she's the artist who I quoted earlier, who said there's no separation between art and life. Her very personal relationship to becoming an artist. Her mother was an artist. Her grandmother was an artist. Her young daughter is featured in our film. You actually see her making art alongside her mother. And her Rose's mode, as was her mother and grandmother's mode, is clay. That is her medium. And I think the relationship between Rose's place, Rose lives in the Santa Clara Pueblo in New Mexico, where she grew up. She left for a period of time, went to RISD, and has chosen to come back and make her life and raise her family and build her studio in this place. Really, I think informs the work on like a really like deep and natural and personal personal way, which I think only really gets illuminated through the lens of storytelling. Like the opportunity we had to film with Rose, to travel with Rose to sites where her ancestors have lived, as she says in our film, for thousands of years, really is, I think a really poignant, emotional, incredible moment, and really, I think, also contextualizes the work in a way where that's oftentimes hard to do in the context of, a public artwork or, an exhibition that happens in a city. So that might be one to look at for sure. In our new season too, we are featuring a profile on the Guerrilla Girls, who they really probably represent the artists, if you will. They're artist activists that have been working the longest. So they're a group that formed in the 80s and have been agitating the art world ever since. In fact, they're part of an episode called Bodies of Knowledge, and the Guerrilla Girls were the inspiration for the title of that hour. They described in our first studio visit with them, and they wear gorilla masks. They are an anonymous collective, protecting their identity as artists is a really important part of their work. It allows them to speak out and not be, not be defamed, I suppose. But they described their body of work as a body of knowledge. And that was a really interesting idea to think about an artist, or in their case, a collective, amassing a body of knowledge and calling that art. And it was really resonant for us in speaking with them, because it connected so much with what we've seen over the last 10 years or 10 years plus of artists taking on the role of researcher or investigator, or, in some cases, truth teller. And I think now in this age of information and misinformation and disinformation, artists are even more compelled to get to the root of things. And here you have the Guerrilla Girls who've been, doing it for so many decades.
It always struck me that, a lot of what the Guerrilla Girls do is kind of quantifying the inequality and making what, nowadays we may refer to as infographics about the inequity.
Yeah, it's very effective. I mean, it was very effective when they started plastering posters on gallery storefronts and and holding placards outside of museum in the 80s. And of course, it's still really effective today. And now there's multiple platforms in which information like that can be conveyed. But their dedication to the subject of it is, I think, unparalleled, and giving the Guerrilla Girls an opportunity to tell their story that is not just one that looks to a past, but one that is very active in a future has been, a real gift for us.
Well, Tina, I really appreciate you taking time out today. I can't wait to watch the first episode, which premieres on Friday, April 7th at 10 p.m. Eastern on PBS. I really appreciate you just kind of pulling back the curtain on the production and give us a little bit of insight on what we can expect from art in the 21st century this year.
Thank you, Craig. It's been a pleasure.
That's all the time we have for this week. You've been listening to Art Sense. You can find the show on Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher Radio, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. If you've enjoyed this podcast, be sure to subscribe. And while you're there, please rate the show and leave a quick review. Your feedback is the key to other folks finding us. And if you'd like to see images related to the conversation, read the transcript, and find other bonus features, you can go to Cambia.art and click on the podcast tab. If you'd like to reach out to me, you can email me at craig@cambia.art. Thanks for listening.